They replied, and the Baron turned to Martin once more. "Perhaps we may proceed?" Martin nodded several times, consulted a sheaf of notes he held in one hand, and marched to confront the line of candidates. "Right! The Baron's waiting! The Baron's waiting! Who's first?" Will's eyes down, shifting nervously from foot to foot, suddenly had the strange sensation that someone was watching him. He looked up and actually started with surprise as he met the dark, unfathomable gaze of Halt, the ranger. Will hadn't seen him come into the room. He realized that the mysterious figure must have slipped in through the side door, while everyone's attention was on the craftmaster as they made their entrance. Now he stood behind the Baron's chair, slightly to one side, dressed in his usual brown and gray clothes and wrapped in his long, mottled gray and green ranger's cloak. Halt was an unnerving person. He had a habit of coming up on you when you least expected it, and you never heard his approach. The superstitious villagers believed that rangers practiced a form of magic that made them invisible to ordinary people. Will wasn't sure if he believed it, but he wasn't sure if he disbelieved it either. He wondered why Halt was here today. He wasn't recognized as one of the craftmasters, and as far as Will knew, he hadn't attended a choosing session prior to this one. Abruptly, Halt's gaze cut away from him, and it was like as if a light had been turned off. Will realized that Martin was talking once more. He noticed that the secretary had a habit of repeating statements, as if he were followed by his own personal echo. "Now then, who's first? Who's first?" The Baron sighed audibly. "Why don't we take the first in line?" he suggested in a reasonable tone, and Martin nodded several times. "Of course, my lord. Of course. First in line, step forward and face the Baron." After a moment's hesitation, Horace stepped forward out of the line and stood at attention. The Baron studied him for a few seconds. "Name?" And Horace answered, stumbling slightly over the correct method of address for the Baron. "Horace Atman, sir, my lord." "Do you have a preference, Horace?" the Baron asked, with the air of one who knows what the answer is going to be before hearing it. "Battle school, sir," Horace said firmly. The Baron nodded. He'd expected as much. He glanced at Rodney, who was studying the boy, thoughtfully assessing his suitability. "Battlemaster," the Baron said. Normally he would address Rodney by his first name, not his title, but this was a formal occasion. By the same token, Rodney would usually address the Baron as Sir, but on a day like today, my lord was the proper form. The big knight stepped forward, his chain mail and spurs chinking slightly as he moved closer to Horace. He eyed the boy up and down, then moved behind him. Horace's head started to turn with him. "Still," Sir Rodney said, and the boy ceased his movement, staring straight ahead. "Looks strong enough, my lord, and I can always use new trainees." He rubbed one hand over his chin. "You ride, Horace Altman?" A look of uncertainty crossed Horace's face as he realized this might be a hurdle to his selection. "Well, no, sir, He was about to add that Castle Wards had little chance to learn to ride, but Sir Rodney interrupted him. "No, master, that can be taught." The big knight looked at the Baron and nodded. "Very well, my lord. I would take him for battle school, subject to the usual 3 months probationary period." The Baron made a note on a sheet of paper before him and smiled briefly at the delight and very relieved youth before him. "Congratulations, Horace. Report to battle school tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp." "Yes, sir," Horace replied, grinning widely. He turned to Sir Rodney and bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," the knight replied cryptically. "You don't know what you're in for." "Who's next, then?" Martin was calling as Horace, grinning broadly, stepped back into line. Alice stepped forward gracefully, annoying Martin, who had wanted to nominate her as the next candidate. "Alice Mainwaring, my lord," she said in her quiet, level voice. Then, before she could be asked, she continued, "I request an appointment to the diplomatic service, please, my lord." Harold smiled at the solemn-looking girl. She had an air of self-confidence and poise about her that would suit her well in the service. He glanced at Lady Pauline. "My lady," he said. She nodded her head several times. "I have already spoken to Alice, my lord. I believe she'll be an excellent candidate, approved and accepted." Alice made a small bow of her head in the direction of the woman who would be her mentor. Will thought how alike they were, both tall and elegant in their movements, both grave in manner. He felt a small surge of pleasure for his oldest companion, knowing how much she had wanted this election. Alice stepped back in line, and Martin, not to be forestalled this time, was already pointing to George. "Right, you're next, right, you're next. Address the Baron." George stepped forward, his mouth opened and closed several times, but nothing came out. The other wards watched in surprise. George, long regarded by them all as an official advocate for just about anything, was overcome with stage fright? He finally managed to say something in a low voice that nobody in the room could hear. Baron Arnold leaned forward, one hand cupped around his ear. "I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that," he said. George looked up at the Baron, and with an enormous effort, spoke in a just audible voice. "George Carter, sir. Scribe school, sir." Martin, ever a stickler for the proprieties, drew breath to berate him for the truncated nature of his address. Before he could do so, and to everyone's evident relief, Baron Arnold stepped in. "Very well, Martin. Let it go." Martin looked a little aggrieved, but subsided. The Baron glanced at Nigel, his chief scribe and legal officer, one eyebrow raised in question. "Acceptable, my lord," he said, adding, "I have seen some of George's work, and he really does have a gift for calligraphy." The Baron looked doubtful. "He's not the most forceful of speakers, though, is he, scribe master? That could be a problem if he has to offer legal counsel at any time in the future." Nigel shrugged the objection aside. "I promise you, my lord, with the proper training that this sort of thing represents no problem. Absolutely no problem at all, my lord." The scribe master folded his hands together into the wide sleeves, the monk-like habit he wore as he warmed his theme. "I remember a boy who joined us some 7 years back, rather like this one here. As a matter of fact, he had the same habit of mumbling to his shoes, but we soon showed him how to overcome it. Some of our most reluctant speakers have gone on to develop absolute eloquence, my lord, absolute eloquence." The Baron drew breath to comment, but Nigel continued in his discourse. "It may even surprise you to hear that as a boy I myself suffered from a most terrible nervous stutter. Absolutely terrible, my lord. Could barely put 2 words together at a time." "Hardly a problem now, I see," the Baron managed to put in dryly, and Nigel smiled, taking the point. He bowed to the Baron. "Exactly, my lord. We'll soon help young George overcome his shyness. Nothing like the rough and tumble of a scribe school for that, absolutely." The Baron smiled in spite of himself. The scribe school was a studious place where voices were rarely ever raised and where logical reason debate reigned supreme. Personally, on his visits to the place, he had found it mind-numbing in the extreme. Anything less like a rough and tumble atmosphere he could not imagine. "I'll take your word for it," he replied. Then to George he said, "Very well, George. Request granted. Report to scribe school tomorrow." George shuffled his feet awkwardly. "Mumble, mumble, mumble," he said, and the Baron leaned forward again, frowning as he tried to make out the low-pitched words. "What was that?" he asked. George finally looked up and managed to whisper, "Thank you, my lord." He hurriedly shuffled back to the relatively anonymity of the line. "Oh," said the Baron, a little taken back. "Think nothing of it. Now, next is—" Ginny was already stepping forward. Blonde and pretty, she was also, it had to be admitted, a little one on the chubby side. But the look suited her, and at any of the castle's social functions, she was as much of a sought-after dance partner with the boys in the castle, both year-mates in the ward and the sons of castle staff as well. "Master Chubb, sir," she said now, stepping forward right to the edge of the Baron's desk. The Baron looked into the round face, saw the eagerness shining there in the blue eyes, and couldn't help smiling at her. "What's about him?" he asked gently, and she hesitated, realizing that, in her enthusiasm, she had breached the protocol of choosing. "Oh, your pardon, sir. My Baron, your lordship," she hastily improved, her tongue running away with her as she managed the correct form of address. "My lord," Martin prompted her. Baron Arnold looked at him and raised eyebrows. "Yes, Martin," he said. "What is it?" Martin had the grace to look embarrassed. He knew that his master was intentionally misunderstanding his interruption. He took a deep breath and said in an apologetic tone, "I simply want to inform you that the candidate's name is Jennifer Dalby, sir." The Baron nodded at him, and Martin, devoted servant of the heavy-bearded man, saw the look of approval in his lord's eyes. "Thank you, Martin. Now, Jennifer Dalby." "Jenny, sir," said the irrepressible girl, and he shrugged resignedly. "Jenny, then. I assume that you are applying to be apprenticed to Master Chubb." "Oh, yes, please, sir," Jenny replied breathlessly, turning adoring eyes to the portly red-haired cook. Chubb scowled thoughtfully and considered her. could be, he muttered, walking back and forth in front of her. She smiled winningly at him, but Chubb was beyond such feminine wiles. I'd work hard, sir, she told him earnestly. I know you would, he replied with some spirit. I'd make sure of it, girl. No slacking or lollygagging in my kitchen, let me tell you. Fearing that her opportunity might be slipping away, Ginny played her trump card. I have the right shape for it, she said. Chubb had to agree that she was well-rounded. Errol, not for the first time that morning, hid a smile. She has a point there, Chubb, he put in, and the cook turned to him in agreement. Shape is important, sir. All great cooks tend to be rounded. He turned back to the girl, still considering. It was all very well for others to accept their trainees in the wink of an eye, he thought, but cooking was something special. Tell me, he said to the eager girl, what would you do with a turkey pie? Ginny smiled, dazzling at him. Eat it, she answered immediately. Chubb rapped her on the head with the ladle he carried. I meant, what would you do about cooking it? He asked. Ginny hesitated, gathered her thoughts, then plunged into a lengthy technical description of how she would go about constructing such a masterpiece. The other 4 wards, the Baron, his craft masters, and Martin listened in some awe, with absolutely no comprehension of what she was saying. Chubb, however, nodded several times as she spoke, interrupting as she detailed the rolling of the pastry. 9 times, you say? He said curiously, and Ginny nodded, sure of her ground. My mother always said, 8 times make it flaky, and once more for love, she said. Chubb nodded thoughtfully. Interesting, he said. Then, looking up at the Baron, he nodded. I'll take her, my lord. What a surprise, the Baron said mildly, then added, Very well. Report to the kitchens in the morning, Jennifer. Ginny, sir, the girl corrected him again, her smile lighting up their room. Baron Errol smiled. He glanced at the small group before him. And that leaves us with one more candidate. He glanced at his list, and then looked up to meet Will's agonized gaze, gesturing encouragement. Will stepped forward, nervousness suddenly dry his throat so that his voice came out in a barely whisper. Will, sir. My name is Will.